Now, I feel like I should make a couple things clear right at the start. First, I'm only a casual fan of the Harry Potter franchise, meaning I've seen each and every one of the movies, in most cases more than once or twice, but I've never read the books and I'm not overly familiar with the lore. Second, as a lot of you already know, I am a huge Star Wars fan, to put it mildly, and I'm also a fan of the prequels, though I certainly acknowledge, also to put it mildly, that those movies have their flaws, which is a sentiment that seems to be getting echoed by some Harry Potter fans right now in regards to the Fantastic Beasts series. That generally, a lot of them seem to think these new movies, set many decades before the events of the originals, are okay despite some flaws in the fact that they don't feel like they live up to those originals or are necessarily all that consistent with them. However, just like with the Star Wars prequels and George Lucas, there are some fans who think J.K. Rowling is killing her franchise with prequels right now, and are rather upset about the apparent retcons or retroactively changing established continuity to fit her new story. And just like with the Star Wars prequels, and even the sequels now, it's hard, if not impossible, to really get a firm grasp or to begin to work out the percentages of how many fans feel one way and how many fans feel another. Was it just a vocal minority spewing hate for the Star Wars prequels while most fans enjoyed or at least accepted them? Or were those angry, outraged fans who were the loudest actually part of the majority that was otherwise remaining relatively silent? And depending on who you ask and how they personally feel, you're likely going to get very different answers to those questions. And the same, of course, now applies to the Fantastic Beasts series. But one thing does seem hard to dispute, and that is that The Crimes of Grindelwald, the most recent movie in this new series, has been the poorest reviewed by critics in the entire franchise. As already mentioned, it's being torn apart by some fans, mostly, from what I can tell at least, because of glaring inconsistencies between it and the original Harry Potter series, because it's adding things to the lore that make one wonder why they've never been mentioned or used before. One such example, and this will be a very minor spoiler, is that at one point in the movie, Newt, the main character, uses some type of magical dust that allows him to see the events of the previous day in almost absolute clarity. And if such a thing exists, it makes one wonder why it's never been used before. Because every mystery or crime could easily be solved by sprinkling this dust at the scene of said crime and seeing how it all played out. And there are plenty of times in the original Harry Potter series, which of course takes place years after this movie in the timeline, when such dust could have, would have, and should have been used, but never was. And now we're left to wonder why. It's very similar to the Holdo maneuver in The Last Jedi, because it was so effective it makes one wonder why it was never used before in other dire circumstances, or why it was never weaponized. And some fans will bend over backwards to try and explain why that was the first time we've ever seen it, but the simple truth is when something is that effective, people will find a way to use it, if not exploit it. If hyperspace could be used as a weapon, factions in Star Wars, like the Empire, would have used it to its fullest potential. Just like with magical dust that allows one to see the past, would be used to its fullest potential. Though I can already imagine some fans making excuses for this movie, that maybe the dust comes from a creature only Newt knew about and has since gone extinct, or something along those lines. And perhaps the sad irony in all these situations is it's the same fans that once almost deified these creators of the franchises, like Lucas and Rowling, the ones that put them on the pedestal in the first place, that are now the ones that can so quickly and easily turn around and vilify them and try to tear them down. And what those on the outside looking in don't understand, and what other fans who blindly accept all things from the creators don't always understand, is that these attacks come from a position of love, as odd as that sounds, because people don't get worked up and rant and rave about things they don't care about. They only do it when they care a great deal. So when somebody says that George Lucas ruined their childhood with the prequels, which many have said, they're not trying to be mean-spirited for the sake of being mean-spirited. They're trying to encapsulate how much the original trilogy meant to them and how much the prequels let them down. And I'm not saying they're necessarily justified to get that nasty with their criticisms, but fans do and should have every right to express their opinions to the creator, or don't share your work. In fact, listening to the fans is probably about the only way a creator, and by creator I mean author, filmmaker, or what have you, anyway, it's about the only way they can ever truly begin to understand what it is people actually like about their work, though this can also be a double-edged sword. Because it's very hard for a creator to step outside of themselves and see their work through the eyes of others. And in general, I think there are two types of creators. The rare type who thinks everything they do is amazing, and the more common type who thinks everything they do is crap and they're never quite happy with it. Lucas obviously is the latter, which is essentially confirmed by the existence of the Star Wars Special Editions, where he decided to go back and tinker with what many already considered masterpieces. In fact, if I'm recalling right, Lucas once said something to the effect that movies or works of arts are never actually done, they're just finally revealed or shown off. And I do think creators are at their best when they're just making something for themselves, or something they themselves would like and enjoy, and not overly concerned about what others will think of it. And this is where the double-edged sword comes into play. Because once you start to amass a fan base, once people start literally telling you what they love about your work and want to see more of it, you obviously now have a good sense of what people are expecting out of you or what they want it to be, which means you can either try and give them what they want, or you can continue to do your own thing and risk that fans won't like it, but that you'll probably be satisfied with it, or satisfied as you can be. Or you can of course try and find a happy middle ground, which likely isn't going to please either the creator or the fans. And with the Star Wars prequels, I think it's safe to say that Lucas told the story he wanted to tell with little or no regard to what fans actually wanted. And I don't mean that to sound as bad as it probably does, because I'm not implying Lucas didn't care at all about the fans. What he cares about the most, though, is not telling the same story twice. He wanted to do something new and original, and it's hard to fault him for that. It's hard to tell the guy who created Star Wars that he can't do whatever he wants with it, even if it means the fans wouldn't be happy. Because it was his story, his company, and his money on the line with the prequels. And I know some of you will want to try and point out that I'm contradicting myself from previous videos where I've talked about artistic freedom, and I've argued that modern Star Wars under Disney does indeed have to worry about what fans want, that it should be one of their top priorities, in fact, if not the top priority. The main difference here is that Disney is a publicly owned company with shareholders to answer to, that is very much trying to turn Star Wars into a long-standing, extremely profitable film franchise, whereas Lucas was mainly just trying to tell the stories he wanted to tell, and he had to answer to no one. And no, I'm not trying to imply that Lucas didn't enjoy all the money he made off of Star Wars, but if money was his main drive, I don't think he waited 16 years before making the prequels, with the main reason for the wait being that the technology didn't exist to tell the story the way he wanted to tell it. I mean, if he wanted to make more money, all he would have had to do is crank out one Star Wars movie after another and try to cater them more towards what fans wanted. Which basically seemed to be Disney's plan with Star Wars until The Last Jedi, which didn't follow the formula of catering to fans and instead tried to subvert expectations, and was met with, shall we say, mixed reactions, much like how the prequels were also met with mixed reactions for not being exactly what fans expected. Which, of course, brings us right back to the double-edged sword that goes along with beloved long-running franchises. How do you keep things fresh, new, and interesting? How do you bring new fans in while never losing the spirit of the old and losing those long-term fans? In other words, how do you capture lightning in a bottle not just once or even twice, but indefinitely, and make everybody happy continuously? Especially when, let's be honest here, the creators themselves likely don't know exactly what it was that made their first work so great and cherished in the first place. I mean, yeah, you could go with the generic answer that it was because they created something that connected with or just resonated with people, and in the case of Star Wars, it was molded after the hero's journey, which seems to subconsciously appeal to people. But why it worked so well for George Lucas with the original trilogy, when others have used the exact same formula and achieved nowhere near the same success, is not only hard to pinpoint, but even harder to duplicate, even by the same person, let alone someone different coming in to tell this story now, which is why the sequel trilogy has been so divisive. And when it comes to prequels, the problem is almost twofold, because it's really hard to tell a story in reverse order. It's hard to advance a story by going backwards in it, if you will. It's hard to have a major reveal in a prequel that wouldn't have been common knowledge in the later parts of the story, and still have any sort of cohesive story on your hands. Or vice versa in a way, where the prequel would spoil a huge moment in the original for anyone who watches them in chronological order, like how anyone who watches the Star Wars prequels before the original trilogy will have the Vader "I am your father" moment spoiled by the prequels. Yet if the prequel doesn't enhance the later part of the story in some respect, if it doesn't offer information we didn't know, well then what's the point of telling the prequel in the first place? And this kind of leads to one of the real problems with prequels, that they offer the creators a chance to go back and add things or adjust some of the finer elements of their story that they may not have initially thought of when creating the original. Because I think there is this common misbelief, though it's a silly one when you really think about it, that creators have this eureka moment where everything that ever has been or will be in their fictional universe just suddenly comes to them, when in reality, most of the time the greatest stories start as little more than a vague, albeit good idea, and maybe the concept for a character or two, and as they go on, more and more ideas just come to them, and sometimes those ideas come to them well after the fact, and a prequel allows them to go back and include that new idea into their story. An example of this would be the midi-chlorians in Star Wars, because one could ask why Yoda and Obi-Wan never mentioned them to Luke in the original trilogy, and sure, you could say Luke didn't really need to know about them, but the real answer is that George Lucas simply hadn't thought of them yet back then. In fact, I'd say that while creating the first Star Wars movie, or A New Hope, Lucas hadn't given much thought at all to how the Force works. He based it loosely off a couple different religions and ideas, and that was about that. Because one thing to keep in mind is that Lucas never even knew if he'd get the chance to make a sequel, so there really wasn't much of a point to fully fleshing out the Force. And then, mostly through Yoda's words in The Empire Strikes Back, we learn about what Lucas had essentially decided the Force was going to be in the wake of the success of that first movie. And then, many years later in the prequels, after Lucas had plenty of time to think and dwell on it, and maybe somehow became intrigued by the idea of symbiotic relationships and wanted to incorporate them into a story, he decided to elaborate further on just what the Force is and introduce the midichlorians. And the funny thing is that Lucas likely thought the fans would appreciate a further explanation as to what the Force is and how it works. In fact, I think many times creators like to get into the nuts and bolts of how things in their fantasy stories work, because it not only shows just how clever they can be, but it kind of validates the story in a sense. When you can give concrete rules and show the mechanisms that make the story work, it makes that story feel more real or based off something tangible in a sort of way. But at the same time, when you as a fan have the curtain pulled back, it makes that thing that you were once fascinated by, in this case the Force, feel less mysterious and therefore less interesting. Yet another problem with prequels that goes along with all this is the incredibly unbelievable coincidences that creators sometimes feel the need to shoehorn into their stories, like Anakin being the creator of C-3PO, for example, because the odds of that droid ending up in the possession of the son of Anakin someday are so ridiculously high that not even 3PO himself could calculate those odds. Though, in a story such as Star Wars, you do have the plot convenience of saying the Force willed it to be that way. And finally here, perhaps the greatest problem with prequels, and this goes along with creators not necessarily understanding why the original story was so beloved in the first place, is the need to make everything so much bigger in them. Because when you step back and look at both the original Star Wars trilogy and the first Harry Potter series, you see one huge similarity between them, and that is that there was a very small core group of characters that the stories focused on or revolved around almost entirely, and one very simple and singular purpose they were trying to accomplish, which was pretty much stopping the bad guy and their evil regime. And I'm certainly not saying there wasn't world building in both those original stories, but it always felt secondary to the plight of our main characters. In fact, everything always felt secondary to the plight of the main characters, which is why we connected so well and so easily with them, because we were always going on this journey just with them. However, in the Star Wars prequels and now in the Fantastic Beasts movies, it feels like the point is to set a stage, to world build and to enhance the other story we already know. And considering how much I do enjoy world building in stories, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it gives off a much different feeling and doesn't always capture that same simple magic or spirit that the original story had. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me why you think prequels don't seem to always capture that same magic as the originals do, and why they can, in some cases, turn fans against the creators of the franchise. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars and a little bit of Harry Potter. And until next time, thanks for watching.